Hey alls, what's up? Before I get into the topic of this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about my top surgery fund. Um, so if you guys know me, you guys know that I like to work for what I have, and I have been for more than 2 years now, working my ass off to save as much money as I could for top surgery, while I was helping my mom pay her bills, while I was paying rent, while I was paying for my own medical bills out of pocket. But recently, I've had to deplete that fund quite a bit, paying for my car, paying for some vet bills for one of my cats, and it's really disparaging because it took me so long to come up with so little money because of my physical disability, which limits the amount I can work without getting extremely ill. I do, you guys know that I am about to be living on the road, homeless, that word has a stigma. I don't always use it, sometimes I do. I say living on the road because I'll be living in my car. I do have a couple ways I plan on making money in that situation, but it's really going to be enough to survive, and that's going to be about it, if it's even that much. So I've started a GoFundMe because at this point it's very hard for me to keep going without top surgery. I've been binding for almost 6 years now, and with my chronic illness and my dysphoria, it's really hard. My chronic illness is causing my ribs to not react very well to binding, and of course binding in the long term isn't great for your ribs anyway, so my ribs are very unstable. They like to slip. They can be moved just by pressing, on a rib, and it wobbles, basically, which your ribs should not do. But I cannot leave the house without a binder. I don't have a huge chest, but it is big enough that I feel like it's obvious through clothes. So I can't leave my house without a binder, so it's very distressing. So yeah, I'm gonna link to my defundme. I'm gonna link to my GoFundMe in the description below. If you can't donate, I would appreciate if you would share it, because that is a big part of a GoFundMe, is getting it spread across multiple platforms to as many people as possible. Thank you very much. I also have big news. As you guys know, I've been an artist for a long time. I went to an art school, and since I lost my job due to my illness, I didn't lose my job. They cut my hours down to 0, basically. Anyway, I have been working constantly on my art, and I have produced, several large pieces, and I have several pieces in the works, and I'm just kind of constantly making art, and I have a buyer who is lined up to buy 5 pieces of art, who's going to be paying me $300, maybe more dollars, and I think it's about a $20 base plus $10 per hour for each piece. The $20 covers materials, and the $10 an hour is, labor. So it's good, it is a fair price that she is paying, and it is very nice to see that come to fruition, that all that money is going directly into my savings, because my savings is, it's going directly into my checking, because my checking is almost empty, and that is what I pay for all my medicine, all my medical bills, out of. So, yeah, that's really exciting. I will be, before selling these pieces, I will be taking pictures and putting them on my art Instagram, which I will also link below. It is po.artsta on Instagram. So, on to the topic. James Younger and the topic of trans children is really big in the media right now, and I've seen a lot of things on both sides from it, but it's really big in the right-wing news, and I figured, as a trans person, I would talk about it. A moderate trans person, a trans person who is not, completely liberal and is definitely not conservative. So I thought I would talk about it. So, for a little background information, James is a 7-year-old child whose parents are currently going through a divorce and custody battle for James and James's twin brother. James's mother claims that she is a trans girl who prefers to present and be referred to as female. And James's father says that he is a cis boy, cis meaning non-trans, whose mother is forcing him into transition. The right has come forward saying that, come forward in support of the father, saying that, allowing this child to transition or even allowing this child to socially transition is child abuse. And the left has come forward saying that not allowing this child to transition is child abuse, and that the father is using the child's transness in the custody battle to defame the mother, stuff like that. It's a very big point of contention right now. Now, a jury ruled 11-1 that custody to the mother, but a judge gave 50-50 medical. Each parent gets half of the child's medical decisions, so they cannot make a decision on the child's medical treatment without one another. So, why is this important? Why is this so contentious? And what does it mean? Well, this case is being used by the right to push laws that would disallow any trans child from transitioning. And, of course, that's a big deal. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about my opinions on the case and my opinions on trans children as a trans person. So, first of all, I'm not going to say whether or not James Younger is a trans girl or a cis boy, because I'm not a judge, I'm not one of the jurors, I'm not either of James's parents, I am not a doctor, nor am I a therapist, nor am I James or anywhere close to James. And this is very important. A lot of people are forming these opinions with one side of the story. They're either listening exclusively to the father or exclusively to the mother. And the problem is that we don't know what's true. This could be a case of a trans child whose transphobic father is, just being transphobic. And this could be a case of Munchausen's by proxy from the mother. You just don't know. So, we don't know. Sorry, I had to go do something. So we don't know, whether or not James is trans. Because we're not anyway attached to these people. And this is not our decision, it is not our lives. And we don't know anything about it. So yeah. But I think it's important to note that if James is not truly trans, before James will be allowed to do anything medical, James will have to go through rigorous doctors, therapists, etc., because James is so young. And this is still years down the line. Before even puberty blockers, there'll have to be therapists signing off on it, probably not just one. Therapists, doctors, etc., who say, this child actually has gender dysphoria. And that's very important. As long as the doctors are highly qualified, they have the ability to know whether or not this is real, hopefully. But on to the topic of trans children as a whole, the right is using this case as a reason to smear the entire idea of trans children and the trans community as a whole. And that's so aggravating, because there are trans children. Science supports trans children and trans people in general. And it's not as simple as just a boy who likes dresses or a girl who likes boys' toys. It is neurological. Scientists have found in numerous studies that the brain of trans people, before hormones, before any medical intervention, that the brain has certain patterns that match closer to the identified sex than the birth sex, the biological genital sex. And this is important because that's why trans people identify that way. Specifically, regions of self-perception are affected most strongly. I don't know if that's a word, but that's the self-perception and self-recognition is what is responsible for dysphoria. When you are looking into a mirror and seeing a body or a face or hearing a voice that does not match your certain areas of your brain, then that self-recognition is very weak and it feels very foreign. And that is what transition is for. And so science supports the neurological reality of being trans. You can't change the structure of the brain without a lobotomy, and so people transition. And sorry I keep being interrupted, but trans kids have been shown to, or kids in general have been shown to have most, or many of them, have a very solid sense of gender identity from a young age. They, except for exceptions, like autistic kids don't form it entirely that young. A few other exceptions, of course, and just the normal outliers. Kids have a very solid sense of gender identity from a young age. Many kids who insist, and show signs of dysphoria and insist they are the other sex and all of that kind of thing, many do persist into being trans. There have been studies that have been falsely cited that say most gender dysphoric kids don't turn out to be trans. What that actually is saying is, number one, most gender non-conforming kids don't turn out to be trans. And it is the conflation of gender dysphoria with gender nonconformity. Most kids who insist do stay trans. Most kids who are experiencing extreme distress with their natal sex often stay trans. Some go through puberty, and anyway, that's whole contentious idea, but frankly, it doesn't matter, because when they're that young, nobody's medically transitioning them. They're allowing them to socially transition and express themselves however they want, but they're not medically transitioning them until they reach an age where they're about to start puberty. And then they might put them on puberty blockers after talking with doctors, talking with, therapists, and determining that could be what's best for the child. And I don't understand why people are so against the idea of puberty blockers. Once you're in the Tanner stage, the first Tanner stage of puberty, if it's distressful or not, generally. And if it's distressful, it needs to be stopped, because you don't want kids having to go through something that's distressful. You can give them time to, figure out what it is they want and need, and talk to doctors and parents and therapists and figure out what's best for them without causing serious harm. Puberty blockers are not seriously harmful. They put cis children on them all the time for precocious puberty. They put people with hormone-sensitive cancers on them. They're not harmful. They are reversible, because if you take them off them, they're just going to go through their natal puberty. And it's really not a big deal. And kids are not being put on hormones young. I think the youngest I know of is like 13, and that's very, very rare. I've met a 14-year-old who went on it. Most of the time it's closer to 16, 17 if you're going to be put on them as a minor. And I don't understand why that's such a point of contention, because these are not your lives, these are not your children, and if your children are seeing a doctor and this is determined to be what's best for them, it's not a horrible thing to let them transition. Some detransition, and the idea that most detransition is bullshit. Some detransition. I think the rate of detransition is like 0.3 or something, maybe not even that high. It's definitely less than 1%, and most people who detransition actually detransition because of societal pressure or family pressure. Most do not detransition because they regret transitioning. You can hear from detransitioners who say, they regret it and stuff, and that's valid, but it is not the representation of all, most, or many, it is a very small portion of transitioners, and that is why, and detransition is why attentive care, attentive therapy, attentive doctors are so important so that the right choice can be made before anything permanent happens. Nothing can be rushed, nothing can be forced. And the case of James Younger, if James is being forced into this, has nothing to do with trans kids whatsoever. Because, most aren't being forced into transition. Most are choosing it because they are dysphoric. And there are rising rates, that I believe that there are rising rates of people misbelieving they're dysphoric. And that is, again, why, time, doctors, therapists, it is why it is also important. It is not something that can be rushed. Rushing it will result in more detransitioners, I believe. You have to experience dysphoria. You have to see a therapist and make sure what you're experiencing is dysphoria and not, a result of trauma or a result of gender nonconformity or disliking gender roles. So, yeah, I think that's really, I got put off track, I don't remember, but I think that's most of what I had to say. It's just that, James's case can't be used against all trans children. Trans children do exist. I was a trans child. I experienced dysphoria. I was a very private child, though I didn't go to my parents with it. Also, I didn't live with my parents at a very young age. But I remember distinctly having moments of, I had friends who passed as boys when they were girls, and I was so extremely jealous, and I wanted to wear boys' clothes and cut my hair really short, and I was really jealous when people called them boys. I wanted them to call me a boy, and it was, this was really early, before puberty. I was like 9, 11, I remember these things happening, and I was a trans child, and at this point, I've come to understand that I would give anything to go back in time and stop female puberty from happening, so that I wouldn't have to go through top surgery. I understand people's concerns, I really do. I don't think it's gonna come a mid-ground, but letting a dysphoric child socially transition, it's never going to be abuse. It's never going to be harmful to the child. It's letting your child express themselves is only ever going to be beneficial, unless they are, expressing themselves in such a way that it could get them hurt, Letting your child express himself is beneficial. So letting your 5-year-old put on dresses and go by a girly name isn't going to hurt them. And puberty blockers for a couple of years to let your child truly figure out who they are and go to doctors and stuff it is reversible. They can always go through their natal puberty. I'm not saying it's without any side effects, because there are side effects to everything, but it gives your child a chance to not have to go through what so many trans people have had to go through. You know, especially a testosterone-based puberty is so irreversible. Trans women suffer so much because they went through one, and they face so much violence because they don't pass, and they face so much job discrimination because they don't pass. And it's very important to actually consider the well-being of the child. Not what you think is the well-being of the child, but the actual well-being of the child. The well-being of trans people. You know, it isn't going to be a one case represents all. Each case is going to be individual, and each case has to take a long time with a lot of doctors to figure out what's right. And that is what's best for the child. It's not forcing them to stay who they aren't. It's not forcing them to transition if they're not trans, or saying they're trans if they just like girls' toys. None of that is beneficial. It is allowing the child to express themselves, and allowing the child and doctors and everybody who's, you know, the parents and the child and the therapists and the doctors all to figure out what's right. And it's not butting in where you're not involved. You're not involved in the James Younger case. You're not. And to everyone who says children are too young to make that kind of decision, they don't have the maturity for it, I would like to say that my niece has a brain tumor, and she's had it since she was 3 years old. Recently, it came back once again, and she has been forced at 13 years old to decide that instead of another brain surgery, she would rather die, because she's had 8 brain surgeries. She would rather die than have another brain surgery. She had to make that decision at 13. A child making the decision to dress a different way or go by a different name is nowhere near as extreme as that. A teenager making the decision to medically transition when they're in extreme distress of their body and their puberty is nowhere near as extreme as that. It requires maturity, yes, but it's not some impossible decision that kids just can't make. Kids make hard decisions all the time. Kids have to make way harder decisions than to be who they are. Peace.